Right now, you are warm. Your body rests in comfort. The air around you is breathable, clean, predictable. Outside your window, the world continues its familiar rhythm. Trees grow. Rain falls. Seasons change with gentle reliability. The sun rises each morning with dependable certainty, and the temperature remains within a range that feels normal, expected, safe. You've never known a world where the sky itself turned against you, where the sun disappeared for years, where every breath of air carried the taste of ash and the promise of cold. But 70,000 years ago, your ancestors were not warm. They huddled in caves along the coast of what we now call South Africa, watching ash fall from the sky like gray snow that never melted. The sun had disappeared behind a veil of volcanic dust so thick that noon looked like twilight. Plants were dying across entire continents. Animals were vanishing from landscapes they had occupied for millions of years. And humanity, all of humanity, every single person who walked the earth, had been reduced to a few thousand souls clinging to survival on the edge of extinction. These were not different tribes scattered across the globe. This was everyone. Every human alive. Every potential ancestor. Every possible future compressed into a handful of small groups desperately trying to stay alive through conditions that should have killed them all. This is the story of how humans almost ended. How we were pushed to the very brink of disappearing forever, closer to extinction than perhaps any other moment in our species' history. How a planet turned hostile in ways that seemed impossible, how the sky went dark and stayed dark, and how our species faced the most terrifying challenge in our entire existence. It's a story written in ash layers preserved in ancient ice, in the genetic signatures carried by every person alive today, in the archaeological remains of coastal caves where desperate families waited for a world that seemed determined to end them. But it's also the story of survival, of human resilience tested beyond any reasonable limit and somehow, impossibly, prevailing, of innovation born from desperation, cooperation forged in crisis, and the stubborn refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed like the only logical choice. As you listen to this story, you might drift away. That's perfectly fine. Your mind may wander through these ancient landscapes, picturing the ash falling, the cold settling in, the small fires burning in dark caves. Or you may simply let the words wash over you as you sleep, the narrative flowing past like a gentle river carrying you toward rest. The story will continue either way, gentle and steady, moving through time like water moves through stone, slowly, inevitably, carving out the truth of what happened all those thousands of years ago. There's no need to remember every detail. No test at the end. No requirement to stay alert or focused. Just a journey backward through 70 millennia, to a time when everything hung in the balance, and humanity's future was anything but certain. You can sleep through parts of it. You can wake up during others. The story doesn't mind. It will be here, patient and calm, waiting for your attention when you have it to give, and continuing peacefully when you don't. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the weight of your body against whatever supports it. Notice the temperature of the air, the sounds around you, the gentle pull of sleep beginning to work on your consciousness. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do except rest and listen, or rest and not listen, whichever feels right in this moment. We're going back to the ice age that nearly ended us all. Back to a time when the world forgot how to be kind, and humans learned what it truly meant to survive. 100,000 years ago, Africa breathed with a rhythm that had continued for millions of years, a steady pulse of life that filled every corner of the continent with possibility. The land stretched vast and varied beneath a reliable sun that rose each morning and set each evening with the kind of predictability that allowed life to plan, to prepare, to simply exist without the constant fear of catastrophe. In the east, grasslands rolled golden to the horizon, endless waves of vegetation that moved with the wind like the surface of a green and amber ocean. In the south, coastlines met the Indian Ocean in a gentle collision of land and water, where waves had been carving the same rocks for millennia, creating tide pools that teemed with life in their protected spaces. In between these extremes, forests held their ground with the patient strength of ancient things, their canopies filtering sunlight into the gentle green glow that made the forest floor a place of shadows and secrets. Rivers carved their ancient paths through all of it, following routes they had followed for so long that the shape of the land itself had been molded to accommodate their passage. Life filled every available space with an abundance that seems almost unimaginable now. Herds of antelope moved across the grasslands in numbers that darkened the ground beneath them. Elephants browsed through forests and savannas, their intelligence and memory creating generational knowledge of where to find water during the dry seasons, where the best feeding grounds could be found, where predators were likely to lie in wait. Lions, leopards, and wild dogs followed the herbivores in the eternal dance of predator and prey that shaped behavior and evolution in equal measure. Birds filled the skies with their calls and their colors. Insects hummed in the warm air. Fish swam in rivers and lakes. The continent was alive in every sense of the word, a living organism of interconnected ecosystems that functioned with the complexity of billions of years of evolution. And humans were there too, woven into this tapestry of life as just another thread, neither dominating nor insignificant, simply existing as one species among many. There weren't many of us, perhaps a few 100,000 scattered across the entire continent in small groups that never saw each other, that lived and died without ever knowing that other humans existed beyond their immediate world. These groups were small because the land could only support so many people in any given area. 20 people here, 30 there. Occasionally, when resources were particularly abundant, a group might swell to 50 or 60, but this was unusual and often temporary. Resources had limits, and human populations adjusted to meet those limits whether through migration, through conflict, or through the quiet arithmetic of survival where some lived and others didn't. We looked almost exactly as we do now, these ancestors of ours. If you could somehow transport a person from 100,000 years ago into the modern world, dress them in contemporary clothing, teach them a modern language, they would be indistinguishable from anyone you might pass on the street. Same height, give or take a few centimeters depending on nutrition and genetics. Same brain size, same capacity for abstract thought and complex reasoning. Same ability to feel love, fear, joy, sorrow, anger, hope. Same tendency to laugh at things that amused them, to cry when they experienced loss, to band together with others in times of crisis. They were us in every way that mattered. But their world was smaller, more intimate, more directly connected to the land and the sky and the movements of animals and the patterns of weather. Each group knew only their territory, only their particular stretch of earth with its specific trees and rock formations and water sources. They knew their sky, the way stars moved across it through the seasons, which constellations appeared before the rains came, which ones marked the times when certain plants would fruit or certain animals would migrate. This knowledge was survival, as essential as food or water or shelter. Imagine a morning in that world, one of countless mornings that happened in sequence across thousands of years, each one similar to the one before and the one after, building a continuity of experience that we can only glimpse through archaeological fragments. You wake as the sun rises over the African savanna, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to the first hints of orange and gold along the eastern horizon. The air is already warm, carrying the complex scent of dry grass heated by yesterday's sun, distant rain that may be falling somewhere beyond the visible horizon, and the organic smell of earth and vegetation that all wild places possess. Around you, your family stirs with the slow movements of people waking naturally, without alarms or schedules, their bodies responding to light and warmth and the internal rhythms that all humans possess. Maybe 20 people in total, spread out in a rough circle around where the fire burned through the night. Some are related to you by blood, siblings and children and parents bound by the accident of birth. Others are related by choice, by years of shared survival that create bonds as strong as any genetic connection. Children sleep close to their mothers, still small enough to need that protection, still young enough that separation from the warmth and safety of a parent's body brings instant distress. Elders rest near the fire pit, close enough to feel its warmth though the coals have gone cold during the night. Their presence in this prime spot a recognition of their value, their knowledge, their years of contribution to the group's survival. The fire matters more than almost anything else in your world. It has been kept alive for days, maybe weeks, maybe even months if the group has been lucky and careful. No one in your group is absolutely certain they could restart it if it died completely. The technique exists in theory, striking the right stones together in the right way to create a spark, catching that spark in a carefully prepared nest of the driest grass mixed with fungus that acts as tinder, breathing on it with exactly the right amount of air to coax flame without extinguishing the fragile ember. Everyone has seen it done. Many have tried it. But the success rate is low, the process frustrating and time-consuming, and the consequences of failure are severe. So someone always tends the fire, adding small sticks through the night, breathing gentle life into embers when they start to fade, protecting this precious resource that provides warmth against the cold of desert nights, protection against predators who fear the light and heat, the ability to cook food which makes more plants edible and meat safer to eat. Lose the fire and you lose all of this at once. As the group wakes, routines begin with the comfortable familiarity of actions performed countless times before. Some women gather ostrich eggshells that were filled with water from a spring 2 hours walk away, each shell stoppered with twisted grass to prevent spillage, the contents precious beyond measure because water sources are not always reliable and the next drought could come at any time. The shells themselves are valuable objects, carefully cleaned and smoothed, sometimes decorated with scratched patterns that mark them as belonging to particular individuals. Breaking one is a minor tragedy. Each shell represents hours of work to find, clean, and prepare, and the knowledge of which ostrich nests to raid without disturbing the birds so much that they abandon the area entirely. Other women move out into the surrounding landscape to collect mangongo nuts from nearby trees, a staple food that provides reliable nutrition throughout much of the year. The process is simple but labor-intensive. Find the nuts on the ground beneath the trees where they've fallen naturally. Crack them open with carefully selected stones that have just the right weight and shape, stones that women might carry with them from camp to camp because finding the perfect nut-cracking stone is not guaranteed in every location. Pick out the rich kernels from inside, sorting out any that show signs of rot or insect damage. The nuts store well if kept dry, taste good in a mild and slightly oily way that makes them satisfying to eat, and provide the kind of steady energy that allows people to work through a day without the desperate hunger that comes from insufficient food. A good mangongo harvest can mean the difference between a comfortable season and a hungry one. Men prepare to hunt, not a large dangerous hunt today, not the kind of coordinated effort required to take down an adult giraffe or a buffalo, but a smaller operation tracking springbok across the grassland. Just a few men, 3 or 4, enough to coordinate their approach and their spear throws, but not so many that they're likely to be spotted by the wary antelope. They carry spears with stone points that represent hours of skilled work, each point carefully napped from appropriate stone that fractures in predictable ways when struck with another stone or a piece of antler. The points are hafted to wooden shafts with plant resin that has been heated to make it sticky, then allowed to cool and harden into a bond stronger than anything else available. Sinew from previously killed animals wraps around the joint, adding security and strength. These spears are valuable tools, maintained carefully, resharpened when the points become dull, replaced only when they break beyond repair. A man might use the same spear for months or even years, developing a relationship with the tool, understanding its balance and weight and the exact motion required to make it fly true toward a target. This is what archaeologists call the Middle Stone Age, a period that stretched across tens of thousands of years during which humans developed increasingly sophisticated relationships with tools and with each other. Humans have been making complicated tools for longer than this, of course. The first stone tools appear in the archaeological record more than 3 million years ago, simple flakes struck from larger stones, sharp enough to cut meat or scrape hides but requiring minimal planning or forethought to create. But by 100,000 years ago, tool-making has become something approaching art. People select specific types of stone for specific purposes. They prepare cores carefully before striking flakes from them. They work stone into predetermined shapes that exist first in the mind and then, through skill and patience, in physical reality. This requires planning, vision, the ability to see the finished tool hidden in the raw material like a sculptor sees a statue in a block of marble. We use fire not just for warmth but for cooking, for hardening wooden spear shafts to make them more durable, for providing light that extends the day beyond sunset, allowing social time and conversation and the transmission of knowledge that happens when people gather in the evening with nothing to do but talk. We speak to each other in complex language, though what those languages sounded like, what words they used, what grammar structures they followed, no recording exists to tell us. We can only infer from the complexity of behavior that the language must have been sophisticated, capable of expressing abstract concepts and teaching complicated processes and telling stories that convey information across generations. We create art, decorating our bodies with ochre ground from iron-rich clay, mixing it with fat to create a paint that adheres to skin and announces something about identity or status or group membership. We collect beautiful shells from rivers and coasts, perhaps to wear as jewelry, perhaps simply because they're attractive and humans have always been drawn to beautiful things. We gather interesting stones, pieces of crystal, or particularly smooth river rocks, keeping them for reasons that may be aesthetic or spiritual or simply because possession of rare objects brings a kind of pleasure that has nothing to do with survival and everything to do with being human. We are human, fully and completely human in every way that matters. Our brains are the same size as modern human brains. Our capacity for abstract thought, for planning, for language, for social bonding, for creativity, all of it is present and functioning at levels indistinguishable from people living today. If we could somehow speak to these ancestors, if we could overcome the language barrier and the cultural differences, we would find people we recognize. People who love their children and mourn their dead. People who laugh and argue and make jokes. People who wonder about the stars and the world beyond their immediate experience. People who are trying, like all people in all times, to build a life worth living in whatever circumstances they find themselves. But we are also vulnerable in ways that modern humans have largely forgotten. Our population is fragile, spread thin across the landscape, existing in small isolated groups that have no contact with each other and no way to call for help if disaster strikes. Groups remain small because resources are limited and the land can only support so many people in any given area. When drought comes, and it does come with irregular but inevitable frequency, people move to follow water and food or they starve where they are. When game migrates, following rains or season changes or their own ancient patterns, hunters follow or they go hungry, abandoning campsites and territories to trail after the herds their survival depends on. When disease spreads through a small group, and disease does spread through these intimate communities where everyone shares food and water and living space, people die in numbers that can cripple the group's ability to function. A sickness that kills 3 or 4 people out of 20 is a catastrophe that might end the group entirely. Each group holds precious information that exists nowhere else, locked in the memories of its members, passed down through demonstration and story and careful teaching from parent to child, from elder to young adult, from skilled practitioner to apprentice. This plant growing near the water is poisonous and will cause vomiting and convulsions and possibly death. That one growing on the hillside heals wounds, preventing the rot and infection that can kill as surely as any predator. These stars appearing in the eastern sky before dawn mean the rains will come in approximately 2 moon cycles. This cave 3 days walk to the north has water even in the dry season, a spring that emerges from the rock and flows year-round, a secret resource that can save lives when drought makes other water sources disappear. This particular type of stone, found near the river bend, fractures in the right way to make good spear points. That type of stone, which looks similar but isn't quite the same, tends to shatter unpredictably and creates points that break at the worst possible moments. The knowledge lives in stories told around fires, in demonstrations watched and practiced and refined, in the careful teaching that happens when an experienced person takes the time to show a younger one exactly how something should be done and why it matters that it be done precisely that way. Lose the people and you lose the knowledge. There are no books to preserve it, no written records, no databases or cloud storage or redundant backups. If the woman who knows which roots are edible dies before she teaches someone else, that knowledge dies with her. If the man who makes the best spear points falls from a cliff and breaks his neck, his particular technique and understanding might die too unless he's already passed it on. If disease kills the elders who remember the stories about the drought of their grandparents' time and where the group went to survive it, that information vanishes from human knowledge entirely, and the next drought might kill people who could have been saved by that lost wisdom. This vulnerability, this precariousness of existing in small isolated groups with finite resources and fragile knowledge transmission, is about to be tested in ways no human has ever experienced before. Because 1,200 miles to the north, beneath the island of Sumatra in Southeast Asia, forces have been building for thousands of years. Magma has been accumulating in a vast chamber beneath the Earth's crust, pressure increasing year by year, century by century, millennium by millennium. The Earth's crust above this chamber has been swelling and cracking, showing signs that anyone who knew how to read them would recognize as warnings of impending disaster. But there is no one who knows how to read them. No science of volcanology. No monitoring equipment. No way to predict or prepare. A supervolcano is awakening. And when it erupts, when the pressure that has been building for so long finally exceeds the strength of the rock containing it, when the Earth itself splits open and releases fury on a scale that dwarfs any volcanic eruption in recorded human history, the world as humans know it will end. Not immediately. Not all at once. But slowly, steadily, inevitably, the catastrophe will spread from its point of origin across the entire planet, and humanity will find itself fighting for survival against an enemy that cannot be reasoned with or fought or escaped. 74,000 years ago, the Earth trembled in a way it had not trembled for tens of thousands of years. This was not the small tremor that makes people pause in their daily activities and look around nervously before returning to normal routines. This was not even a local earthquake, the kind that knocks over objects and cracks walls and sends animals fleeing in confusion. This was something unprecedented in human history, something so massive in scale that it would make even the most violent volcanic eruptions in recorded history seem small and manageable by comparison. This was the kind of geological event that changes the fundamental character of the planet, that resets ecosystems, that draws a line in time separating before from after. At a place we now call Toba, located on the island of Sumatra in Southeast Asia, a crack opened in the Earth's crust that had been under increasing pressure for millennia. The magma chamber beneath this location had been filling slowly, inexorably, fed by the movement of tectonic plates that grind against each other with the patience of geological time. Year by year, century by century, millennium by millennium, molten rock accumulated in the vast underground cavity, the pressure building as more material forced its way up from the depths. The rock above this chamber, solid and strong as it was, had limits to what it could contain. And on that day 74,000 years ago, those limits were exceeded. What emerged was not the relatively gentle flow of lava that characterizes many volcanic eruptions, the kind where molten rock oozes down mountainsides at walking pace, dangerous certainly but also predictable and escapable for anyone not directly in its path. This was an explosion of planetary scale, a release of energy so tremendous that it defies easy comprehension. Imagine, if you can, the force of hundreds of thousands of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously in the same location. Imagine a column of ash and rock and superheated gas blasting into the stratosphere with the force of the Earth's interior being violently expelled through a relatively small opening. Imagine material being thrown upward with such violence that it reaches 30 miles high, 40 miles, climbing into regions of the atmosphere where the air is so thin that nothing living could survive, where the temperature swings between extremes as the material rises through different atmospheric layers. The Toba eruption ejected approximately 670 cubic miles of material into the atmosphere and onto the surrounding landscape in a matter of days. To picture that volume in terms that make any kind of intuitive sense, imagine a cube of rock and ash and pulverized stone 53 miles on each side. Imagine the entirety of a large city, all its buildings and streets and infrastructure, ground into powder and thrown into the sky. Then multiply that by thousands. All of this material, all of this mass, launched upward with such force that it spread across the upper atmosphere like a stain spreading through water, beginning at a point and then expanding outward, carried by winds that circle the entire planet at those altitudes. The explosion itself would have been visible from hundreds of miles away to anyone who happened to be looking in that direction at that moment, though seeing it provided no advantage and certainly no safety. A pillar of fire and darkness reaching toward the heavens, growing wider as it rose, spreading at its top into the characteristic mushroom shape that marks truly catastrophic explosions. The sound that accompanied this explosion was a roar beyond comprehension, beyond anything human ears had ever encountered or would encounter again for 74,000 years. Sound waves traveled across oceans and continents, weakening with distance but still audible thousands of miles away as a continuous thunder that might have lasted for hours or even days as the eruption continued. People in Africa, thousands of miles distant from the source, separated from it by the entire breadth of the Indian Ocean, might have heard a distant rumbling, a sound like continuous thunder coming from no particular direction, sourceless and therefore more unsettling than thunder accompanied by visible lightning. But they wouldn't have understood what it meant. How could they? There was no framework for understanding, no previous experience to draw on, no stories about what happens when a supervolcano erupts because no human had ever witnessed one. The sound might have been worrying, might have seemed like a bad omen, but there was no way to connect it to the catastrophe that was beginning to unfold in the atmosphere above their heads. In the first hours after the eruption, the immediate devastation was total and absolute within the zone of direct impact. Every living thing within hundreds of miles of Toba died instantly or within minutes of the eruption beginning. Forests that had stood for thousands of years incinerated in seconds, the trees exploding from the heat before the ash and rock even reached them. Animals died where they stood or tried to run, overtaken by pyroclastic flows that moved faster than anything on legs could flee, clouds of superheated gas and rock particles that swept across the landscape like invisible fire, killing everything they touched through heat and poisonous gases and the simple mechanical action of being pelted with stone fragments moving at hundreds of miles per hour. The landscape itself transformed into a hellscape of ash and fire and toxic gas, a vision of destruction so complete that it would take centuries for life to return to the areas closest to the eruption. But that immediate zone of destruction, as terrible as it was, represented only the beginning of the catastrophe. The regional devastation, the deaths of millions of plants and animals, the obliteration of every human or animal that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, all of this was merely the opening act. The real catastrophe, the one that would threaten human extinction, was still building in the atmosphere above, invisible but growing more dangerous with each passing hour. The ash column that had risen into the stratosphere began to spread with the inexorable patience of atmospheric processes that care nothing for the lives below. Winds at stratospheric altitudes move in predictable patterns, great circular currents that transport air and everything suspended in that air around the entire globe. Within days of the eruption, a veil of volcanic particles began spreading eastward and westward from the eruption site, carried by these winds, moving steadily across the face of the planet. Picture fine ash, particles so small that they're measured in microns, smaller than grains of sand, smaller than particles of dust, so light and so tiny that they can drift suspended in air for months or even years without falling to the ground. Each particle individually insignificant, but collectively, when you have billions upon trillions of them, enough to form a layer that would eventually encircle the entire Earth, blocking sunlight, changing the fundamental character of the climate. The spreading ash cloud moved east first, darkening skies over Indonesia, then Malaysia, then the Indian subcontinent. It moved westward across the Indian Ocean toward Africa. It moved northward toward what would eventually be called China, Siberia, Russia. Like a slow stain spreading across the sky, visible to anyone who looked up and noticed that the familiar blue was changing, becoming hazy, becoming gray, becoming something that looked wrong even if no one could quite articulate why it looked wrong or what was causing the change. In Africa, people noticed the sun changing, though the change came so gradually at first that it might have taken days or even weeks before anyone remarked on it or felt genuine concern. The sun became hazy, dimmed, like looking through smoke though no fire burned nearby, no wildfires raged in the distance, no obvious source existed for the smokiness that seemed to have infected the air itself. The stars at night grew fainter, harder to see, their familiar patterns becoming obscured as if something was being slowly drawn across the sky between the Earth and the cosmos beyond. The moon took on a strange color during its nightly passage, sometimes appearing reddish or orange in ways that seemed ominous even to people who didn't understand what was causing these changes. And day by day, with the slow inevitability of a tide coming in, the light continued to fade, the sky continued to darken, the familiar world continued to transform into something strange and threatening. Weeks after the initial eruption, after the largest particles had already fallen from the sky near the eruption site, covering everything within hundreds of miles with a thick blanket of gray ash, the finest particles began to fall even in regions thousands of miles distant. Ash began to settle on Africa, not heavy at first, not a catastrophic burial, just a fine dust that appeared on surfaces overnight, that settled on leaves and on water and on skin. Gray powder that got into everything, that couldn't be kept out no matter how carefully people tried to seal their living spaces or protect their food or cover their water containers. Into eyes, causing irritation and redness and pain. Into food, making everything gritty and unpleasant to eat, adding a strange mineral taste to otherwise familiar flavors. Into the clean water sources that groups depended on, settling to the bottom of pools and springs, making the water cloudy and questionable, possibly unsafe, though there was no way to know for certain without drinking it and seeing what happened. Animals reacted strangely to the ash and the changing conditions, their behavior patterns disrupted in ways that made them unpredictable and therefore more dangerous or more difficult to hunt depending on the species. Birds seemed confused, their navigational abilities somehow affected by the changes in the sky or the air or the magnetic fields of the earth, though of course no one understood why birds could navigate in the first place, let alone why that navigation might be failing. Large herbivores grew skittish and nervous, their usual grazing patterns disrupted, moving erratically or abandoning areas they had used reliably for years, responding to cues that humans couldn't perceive but that clearly indicated something was terribly wrong. Something in the air smelled wrong, tasted wrong, felt wrong in ways that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the ancient parts of the brain that recognize danger even when that danger can't be clearly identified or articulated. And then, slowly but measurably, the temperature began to drop. Not quickly enough to notice from one day to the next, not dramatically enough that anyone could point to a specific moment and say this is when the cooling began, but over the course of weeks and months the trend became undeniable. Nights became colder than they had been, cold enough that people sleeping outside the caves or away from the fire woke shivering, wrapping themselves more tightly in whatever animal skins they had available. Mornings took longer to warm up after the cold of night, the sun's heat seeming less effective, less able to drive away the chill that had settled over the land. The air held a coldness that even the sun, when it could be seen through the increasingly thick ash veil, couldn't quite dispel, a persistent chill that crept into bones and muscles and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. For humans watching this unfold, trying to make sense of these changes, trying to understand what was happening and whether it would get worse or better, there was simply no framework for comprehension. No one alive had ever seen a supervolcano or heard stories about what happens when such a thing erupts. No one had any concept of stratospheric ash circulation or the mechanisms by which volcanic particles block sunlight or the cascade of climate changes that follow when the planet's energy budget is disrupted. They could only observe and worry and try to adapt and hope that whatever was happening would eventually stop, that the world would return to normal, that this was just an unusually severe version of familiar weather patterns rather than something fundamentally different and catastrophically dangerous. They could only watch as their world transformed into something colder, darker, and more hostile with each passing week. And they could only try to survive what was coming, though they had no idea of the magnitude of the challenge they were about to face or how close to extinction this event would push them. Because the initial cooling, concerning as it was just the start. The volcanic winter, the real catastrophe that would bring humanity to its knees, was still building in the atmosphere above them, still gathering strength, still preparing to test human resilience in ways that would determine whether our species would survive at all. The first sign that something had changed fundamentally, that this was not just unusual weather that would pass in time, was the grass. The golden savanna grasses that had covered the landscape for as long as anyone could remember, grasses that had provided food for herbivores and seeds for birds and structure to the ecosystem for millions of years, began to change color in ways that indicated something more serious than seasonal variation. Not the healthy brown of dry season, when grasses naturally die back while waiting for rains to return, conserving their energy in roots buried safely underground. Not even the pale yellow of drought-stressed plants struggling but still alive, still capable of recovery if conditions improved. This was different. This was a sickly, unnatural yellowing that spoke of plants that were dying not from lack of water but from lack of light, from the fundamental disruption of the photosynthetic process that allows plants to convert sunlight into the chemical energy they need to live. Without sun, photosynthesis slows and eventually stops entirely. Without photosynthesis, plants cannot create the sugars and starches they need to fuel their growth, cannot build new tissue, cannot store energy for reproduction or survival through difficult periods. The most vulnerable species went first, their needs most delicate, their tolerances most narrow. Delicate flowers that required specific amounts of light to trigger blooming simply failed to bloom at all, their buds staying closed, their reproductive cycles disrupted in ways that meant those species would not produce seeds that year. New shoots, young plants trying to establish themselves in the world, withered and died before they could develop the root systems needed to sustain life through hardship. Young trees, still dependent on relatively high light levels for rapid growth, stopped growing and then began to decline, their leaves turning brown, their branches becoming brittle and lifeless. Then the larger, more established plants began to struggle. The hardy perennial grasses that could usually survive almost anything, that had weathered countless droughts and fires and periods of intense heat or unusual cold, found themselves unable to cope with the prolonged reduction in sunlight. They yellowed. They stopped producing new growth. Their root systems, which in good times would spread deep and wide to anchor the plants and search for water and nutrients, began to die back, the plant withdrawing into itself, trying to conserve what little energy it could still produce. Mongongo trees, which had provided reliable nuts for countless generations of humans and animals, failed to fruit that year. Or they fruited poorly, producing only a few small bitter nuts that barely seemed worth the effort of collecting, nuts that lacked the nutrition and flavor of normal years, nuts that represented the tree's desperate last attempt at reproduction before its energy reserves ran out completely. Tubers in the ground, roots and bulbs that humans had depended on as reliable backup food when other sources failed, stopped growing or rotted where they were, the wet conditions created by rain falling on cold ground without the sun's heat to evaporate the moisture, creating perfect conditions for fungal and bacterial decay. The plant foods that had sustained human groups through previous dry seasons, the diversity of edible species that allowed people to always find something when their first-choice foods were unavailable, simply became unavailable all at once, leaving foraging parties returning to camp with empty hands and worried expressions. For herbivores, the animals that made their living by eating plants, this collapse of plant life was immediate disaster. Antelope and zebra, which could once find grass across wide territories, following the subtle variations in rainfall and temperature that meant good grazing might be found if you were willing to walk far enough to find it, now found nothing no matter how far they walked. They moved, driven by hunger and evolutionary programming that said when food is scarce in one place, try another place. They migrated desperately, wearing themselves out in the search for grazing lands that no longer existed. But better grazing didn't exist. The ash had fallen everywhere, coating plants across entire continents. The cooling had affected every region simultaneously. The reduction in sunlight that was killing plants in one area was killing plants in every area. There was nowhere to migrate to where conditions were better. Some animals starved where they stood, too weak to continue searching, their bodies using up their last reserves of fat and then beginning to consume their own muscles to stay alive until finally even that was not enough and they lay down and died, their carcasses soon picked clean by scavengers who were themselves starving but at least had a meal for one more day. Others migrated until they literally couldn't walk anymore, their legs giving out, their hearts unable to keep pumping blood to bodies that had no energy left to give. Pregnant females either aborted their fetuses, their bodies making the calculation that survival meant not investing precious resources in offspring that probably wouldn't survive anyway, or they gave birth to weak offspring that died within days, unable to nurse properly from mothers who had no milk to give. Predators followed the herbivores because that's what predators do, their survival tied inexorably to the survival of the animals they hunt. But hungry prey makes poor hunting in every sense. Weakened animals are easier to catch, that's true. A lion can bring down a starving zebra with less effort than it takes to bring down a healthy one. But there's very little meat on a starving animal. No thick layer of fat to provide concentrated calories. No well-muscled body to feed a pride for days. Just skin stretched over bones, just enough meat to barely feed the predator that caught it, nowhere near enough to make the energy expenditure of hunting worthwhile in any sustainable way. The predators began to starve too, their hunting successful in the sense that they caught prey but unsuccessful in the sense that the prey they caught didn't provide enough nutrition to sustain them. The entire food web, the complex interconnected system of who eats what and who depends on whom for survival, began to collapse from the bottom up. First the plants died. Then the herbivores that ate the plants. Then the predators that ate the herbivores. And humans, who occupied a middle position in this web, dependent on both plant foods and meat, found themselves watching their food sources disappear one by one. For humans living through this crisis, the catastrophe came in stages that built on each other in ways that made each stage more desperate than the last. First, plant foods became scarce. The women who had reliably gathered nuts and roots and berries, who had provided a steady baseline of nutrition that the group could depend on even when hunting was poor, came back to camp with less each day. One day they brought back perhaps 80% of normal quantities. The next day 70%. Then 60%. Then they started coming back with nearly empty carrying bags, having spent an entire day walking and searching and finding almost nothing worth bringing back. Ostrich eggshells that should have been refilled with fresh water from reliable springs found that some springs had less water than usual, their flow reduced either by the climate changes or by the simple fact that so many animals were desperately seeking water that the springs couldn't keep up with demand. Other water sources tasted strange, contaminated with ash that had settled into them, the water taking on a mineral flavor that made it unpleasant to drink and potentially unsafe, though without the knowledge to test water for contamination, people had to drink what they could find and hope it wouldn't make them sick. Then hunting became difficult in ways that went beyond the usual challenges of tracking and killing dangerous wild animals. The game animals were gone, either dead or migrated to regions far away, scattered across territories that were unfamiliar and might be claimed by other human groups who wouldn't welcome strangers competing for the same scarce resources. Hunters could walk for days and find nothing but old tracks leading to carcasses already picked clean by scavengers, or worse, leading to recently dead animals that had died of starvation or disease, their meat questionable, possibly contaminated, possibly dangerous to eat but tempting because it was meat and people were so hungry. The tracks they did find and follow often led to encounters with other predators, lions or hyenas or leopards who were also starving and therefore more aggressive than usual, more willing to defend a kill or even to view humans as potential prey if the opportunity presented itself. Starvation began to stalk the human groups with the same patience that a predator stalks weakened prey. This was not the ordinary hunger of missing a meal or having less to eat than you'd like. This was the deep, gnawing, all-consuming hunger of insufficient food over weeks and then months. The kind of hunger that dominates your thoughts, that makes it hard to think about anything else, that turns every moment into a calculation of energy expenditure versus energy intake. Your body begins to consume itself when food is insufficient, breaking down fat first, using those reserves to keep vital systems functioning. But once the fat is gone, the body starts breaking down muscle tissue, cannibalizing its own structure to stay alive just a little longer. Energy fades not just as a feeling of tiredness but as a fundamental reduction in your body's ability to function. Walking becomes harder. Thinking becomes clouded and difficult, your brain unable to function at full capacity on insufficient fuel. Your immune system weakens, making you vulnerable to diseases that your body could have fought off easily in times of adequate nutrition. Children suffered first and most visibly. Their small bodies needed proportionally more food than adults relative to their size, their rapid growth and high metabolic rates demanding constant nutrition. When food became scarce, they weakened quickly, their growth stunting, their energy levels dropping, their resistance to disease failing. Parents watched their children grow thin, skin stretched over increasingly visible bones, eyes growing large in faces that seemed to shrink, and they faced impossible choices that no parent should ever have to face. Do you share the last handful of nuts equally among everyone in the group, giving each person a tiny portion that won't really help anyone? Or do you give more to those most likely to survive, the strong adults who can still hunt or gather, hoping to keep the group's productive members alive even if that means accepting that the weak might die? Do you prioritize the children, giving them what little food there is in the hope that the adults can somehow survive on even less until conditions improve? Or do you make the cold calculation that if the adults die, the children will die anyway, so keeping adults alive is the only path that might lead to any survival at all? These questions had no good answers. Every choice involved accepting that some people might die. Every decision was a gamble with lives. And through it all, the sky remained gray, the ash continued to fall, the temperature stayed cold, and weeks became months with no sign that any of this would ever end, no indication that the world would ever return to the warmth and abundance that elderly members of the group could still remember but that younger members had never known. Some groups must have simply given up. Archaeological evidence shows that human population in many regions disappeared entirely during this period. Sites that show regular continuous occupation for thousands of years, layers of archaeological debris that indicate people lived there generation after generation, go suddenly silent during the period of the volcanic winter. No more tools being made. No more fire pits being maintained. No more trash piles accumulating. No signs of human presence at all. Those people either died where they were, their bodies left unburied or buried so simply that no trace remains, or they abandoned those sites and moved elsewhere, trying to find regions where conditions were better. And if they moved, most of them probably died anyway, succumbing to starvation or disease or exposure during desperate migrations to places that turned out to be just as inhospitable as the places they'd left. But some groups survived. Along the southern coast of Africa, where the continent meets the ocean in a long irregular line of beaches and cliffs and estuaries, a few groups found something that the volcanic winter couldn't completely destroy. They found shellfish. They found that mussels and limpets and abalone, those humble creatures that cling to rocks in the intertidal zone, filter feeding on microscopic organisms in the seawater, continued to exist even when everything on land was dying. The ocean's food chains are different from terrestrial food chains, deeper and more complex, with many more levels of organisms between the primary producers and the top predators. And while the cooling affected ocean life too, disrupting currents and changing temperature gradients and reducing the efficiency of photosynthesis even for ocean plants, it didn't cause the same kind of total collapse that occurred on land. A person can live on shellfish if they're willing to work hard enough for their calories. It's tedious work, labor-intensive and time-consuming in ways that gathering nuts or hunting game never were. Prying tiny mollusks from rocks, one by one, your fingers becoming raw from working with sharp shells and rough stone. Cracking them open with stones or tools, extracting small morsels of meat that might be only a few grams from each shell. Processing hundreds of shells, thousands of shells, just to get enough calories to sustain one person for one day. An entire day of gathering, of bending over tide pools, of timing your collection to the twice-daily ebb and flow of tides, might yield only enough food to keep a few people alive, barely enough to prevent starvation but not enough to allow people to regain their strength or to build up any reserves against future shortage. But it was better than starving. It was survival. And the groups that migrated to the coast, that learned to read the tides and understand which beaches were most productive and figure out which types of shells were worth the effort of collecting and processing, those groups bought themselves time. Time to endure. Time to hope. Time to wait for the world to heal, if healing was even possible, if the volcanic winter would ever end, or if this was simply the new permanent state of the world, a cold, dark future that would last until humans either adapted completely or went extinct trying. In 1991, a geneticist named Henry Harpending working at the University of Utah published a study in a scientific journal that would fundamentally change our understanding of human history and our species' brush with extinction. He had been analyzing mitochondrial DNA, that peculiar genetic material that exists outside the cell nucleus in tiny structures called mitochondria, genetic material that has the useful property of being passed down exclusively through mothers to their children, unchanged except for occasional random mutations that occur at predictable rates. By studying these mutations, by comparing the mitochondrial DNA of people from different parts of the world and calculating how many differences existed between them, scientists can work backward through time, estimating how long ago those different populations shared a common ancestor. It's like a molecular clock, ticking away in our cells, keeping time measured not in seconds or hours but in generations and millennia. What Harpending and his colleagues found when they analyzed this genetic data was shocking and at first almost unbelievable. The data showed that around 70,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years depending on the assumptions used in the calculations, the human population went through what geneticists call a bottleneck, a dramatic and severe reduction in total population numbers. The genetic diversity of all humans alive today, all 8 billion of us spread across every continent, living in vastly different environments and speaking thousands of different languages, suggests that at this critical moment in our history, the total human population might have dropped to as few as 3 to 10,000 individuals. Some estimates push even lower, suggesting that at the absolute worst point, there might have been only a few thousand humans alive on the entire planet. Think about that number carefully. 3,000 people. Worldwide. Not 3,000 people gathered in one place where they could help each other and pool resources and maintain the critical mass necessary for a viable population. This was 3,000 people scattered across Africa, probably concentrated in a few coastal regions and other refuge areas where survival was barely possible, divided into small groups of 20 or 30 or 40 individuals each, groups that were isolated from each other by distance and terrain and the simple fact that traveling to find other groups meant expending energy that people barely had to spare. Each group was on its own, fighting for survival without any possibility of rescue or assistance from outside, without any knowledge that other groups even existed or that humanity as a whole was teetering on the edge of extinction. For comparison, 3,000 people is fewer than attend many high school football games in American towns. It's a small city neighborhood, a large apartment complex. A single university lecture hall could hold a significant fraction of the entire human population if everyone had somehow been gathered together. This is a number so small that it seems impossible that a species could recover from it, so precarious that any additional shock, any disease outbreak or environmental catastrophe or simple bad luck, could have easily pushed us over the edge into complete extinction. And this wasn't 3,000 people living in comfortable conditions with reliable food supplies and modern medicine. This was 3,000 people spread across a hostile continent during the worst climate catastrophe in human history, each one struggling daily to find enough food to survive, to stay warm enough not to die from exposure, to avoid the predators and diseases and accidents that could end individual lives and potentially end entire lineages if the wrong person died at the wrong time. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any mistake could be fatal. Any stroke of bad luck could cascade into group extinction. The bottleneck theory, while widely accepted, remains a subject of ongoing scientific debate and refinement. Some researchers argue that the numbers might have been slightly higher, that perhaps 10 to 30,000 people survived rather than 3 to 10,000. Pointing to different interpretations of the genetic data or different assumptions about mutation rates and population structure. Others have pointed to genetic evidence suggesting that the bottleneck might have been even more severe in some regions, with certain populations reduced to just a few hundred individuals before slowly recovering. Some scientists have proposed that the bottleneck might not have been a single sharp event but rather a prolonged period of low population that lasted for thousands of years, with numbers staying dangerously low even after the worst of the climate crisis had passed. But regardless of these debates about exact numbers and timing, everyone who studies human genetics agrees on the fundamental point that cannot be disputed. Humanity came terrifyingly close to extinction. We were reduced to numbers so small that any species with that little genetic diversity, that few individuals, should perhaps not have survived. Many species that have gone through similar bottlenecks, even with larger surviving populations, have eventually gone extinct, unable to recover the genetic variability needed to adapt to changing conditions or simply succumbing to inbreeding depression where harmful genetic variants become common because there aren't enough individuals to dilute them out. What does survival look like when you're part of a species pushed this close to the edge? When you're living through a population bottleneck that will be visible in your descendants' genes 70,000 years later? The archaeological record gives us fragmentary glimpses, tiny windows into these desperate times. At a site called Pinnacle Point, Located on the southern coast of South Africa where cliffs rise above beaches and the Indian Ocean stretches to the horizon, archaeologists have found evidence of continuous human occupation even during the period of the Toba volcanic winter and the climate catastrophe that followed. The site consists of a series of caves carved into the cliff face by thousands of years of wave action and weathering, caves that provide good shelter from the elements, protection from wind and rain and the cold that settled over the land during the volcanic winter. Fresh water comes from a spring nearby, a reliable source that flows year-round even when other water sources dry up during droughts. And most importantly for the people who lived here during the bottleneck period, the site provides direct access to the intertidal zone, that narrow strip of coastline that is covered by water during high tide and exposed during low tide, a zone that teems with shellfish and other marine life that can sustain human populations even when terrestrial food sources have collapsed entirely. The people at Pinnacle Point survived the bottleneck. We know this with certainty because their trash tells the story with a clarity that words sometimes can't match. Archaeological middens, those ancient garbage piles that accumulate wherever humans stay in one place long enough to generate waste, show distinct layers that can be dated and analyzed to reveal what people were eating, what tools they were making, how they were living. During the period corresponding to the volcanic winter, the composition of these middens changes in ways that reveal the crisis and the adaptation. The shells increase dramatically in number and variety, showing that people were eating more shellfish, spending more time gathering from the tide pools and beaches, depending more heavily on marine resources than they had before the crisis. The animal bones in the middens decrease correspondingly, becoming rarer and often showing signs of more complete processing, every scrap of meat and marrow extracted because waste was not an option when food was so scarce. They adapted their diet, their daily routines, their entire way of life to meet the challenge of survival during the volcanic winter. But adaptation at this level, survival under conditions this extreme, requires far more than just finding new food sources or learning new gathering techniques. It requires social cohesion of a kind that holds groups together even when fear and hunger and desperation might tear them apart. It requires cooperation that goes beyond simple mutual benefit and reaches into territory of genuine self-sacrifice, where individuals must sometimes put the group's survival ahead of their own immediate needs. It requires the maintenance and transmission of knowledge across generations even as people are dying, even as the elders who hold crucial information about survival techniques and resource locations succumb to disease or starvation or simple old age accelerated by malnutrition and stress. Imagine you are part of a coastal group during this period, one of the fortunate groups that found refuge where the land meets the sea. Your group's population has shrunk through the mechanisms of crisis. Disease has taken some people, their immune systems weakened by malnutrition, making them vulnerable to infections they might have fought off in better times. Starvation has claimed others, the old and the very young going first as they usually do when food is insufficient, their bodies less able to cope with the deprivation. Accidents have killed others still, people falling from cliffs while gathering seabird eggs, drowning in unexpected rip currents, injured while processing shellfish on slippery rocks and then succumbing to infections because wounded bodies don't heal well when nutrition is inadequate. Your group, which might once have numbered 30 people in better times, is now 15. Some groups are even smaller, reduced to just a handful of individuals holding on through sheer stubbornness and luck. Among those 15 survivors, only 3 or 4 are skilled hunters with the strength and knowledge to track and kill the few animals that remain in the region, men in their prime who remember how to hunt in normal times but must now adapt those skills to hunting in a world where game is scarce and unpredictable. 2 people are elders who remember the old techniques, the accumulated wisdom of lifetimes spent surviving in this landscape. 1 elder knows how to make fire from scratch, a skill that seems simple in description but is maddeningly difficult in practice, requiring exactly the right stones struck together with exactly the right force and angle to produce a spark that must then be caught in exactly the right kind of prepared tinder. The other elder remembers things like which coastal plants are safe to eat, which can be used to treat infections or reduce fever, where fresh water can be found even during the driest seasons. Several people in your group are children, not yet old enough to contribute significantly to food gathering or tool making, still requiring more care and resources than they provide, but representing the future, the next generation that will carry on your group's existence if you can just keep them alive through this crisis. You cannot afford to lose anyone. Every single person carries knowledge that might be irreplaceable. The old woman who knows which plants heal wounds might be the only person in your group who holds that knowledge, information passed down from her mother and grandmother, information that could be lost forever if she dies before teaching it to someone younger. The young man who can track animals by the faintest of signs, who can look at a disturbed pebble or a bent blade of grass and know that prey passed this way hours ago, possesses a skill that took years to develop and cannot be easily replaced if he's lost to accident or disease. Even the child who has learned to spot the shells hidden under seaweed at low tide, who has developed an eye for finding the most productive gathering spots, contributes something valuable to the group's survival, knowledge that might seem trivial but could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation. Fire almost died during the bottleneck period, and if it had died completely, if the last ember had winked out and no one could restart it, humanity might have died with it. In normal times, when populations were stable and conditions were predictable, a group could afford to let their fire go out occasionally. It was inconvenient, certainly, requiring time and effort to restart the fire from scratch, but it wasn't a catastrophe. Someone in the group would know how to make fire, having practiced the technique enough times to be reasonably confident of success. Or if no one in your immediate group could do it reliably, you could travel to a neighboring group and ask for coals, carrying them back carefully in a wrapped bundle of moss or bark, using those coals to restart your own fire. The skill existed and was distributed among enough people that losing one fire or even losing one firemaker wasn't absolutely catastrophic to the species. But during the volcanic winter, when groups had shrunk to minimal numbers and isolation had become the norm and every person's survival skills mattered more than ever before, the distribution of knowledge became critically precarious. What happens when the only person in your group who truly understands firemaking, who has done it successfully multiple times, dies of disease or falls from a cliff while hunting seabirds or simply succumbs to starvation? What if the best tracker in the group, the person whose skills have kept everyone fed during the worst times, suffers an injury that becomes infected and dies despite everyone's best efforts to save them? What if the woman who knows which roots are poisonous and which are safe, who knows which plants can be used to treat fever and which ones can reduce pain, starves to death before she can pass that crucial knowledge on to her daughter who is still too young to fully understand or remember? Knowledge dies with people. And in a bottleneck population where every person matters and every skill is precious, every death becomes a potential extinction event not just for individuals but for the information they carry. Critical survival knowledge can vanish in a moment, leaving surviving group members without the tools or techniques they need to continue living in their environment. This is not just theoretical concern but observable reality. Archaeological sites sometimes show evidence of knowledge loss during difficult periods, with sophisticated tool-making techniques disappearing from the record and being replaced by simpler, cruder tools that suggest the artisans who knew the better techniques had died and their knowledge had died with them. So the survivors adapted not just their diets and their resource-gathering strategies, but their entire cultures and the ways they transmitted knowledge from one generation to the next. Archaeologists can see evidence of this adaptation in the archaeological record from the bottleneck period. Toolmaking becomes more standardized across sites and across time periods, suggesting that techniques were being taught carefully and systematically rather than just being picked up casually through observation. Young people were learning in structured ways, with deliberate instruction replacing the informal learning that might have been sufficient in easier times. The apprenticeship model, where a young person works closely with a skilled practitioner for months or years, learning not just the mechanics of a technique but the subtle understanding that separates competence from mastery, becomes more important and probably more formalized. Fire maintenance becomes ritualized and prioritized in ways that earlier periods don't show evidence of. Someone is always responsible for the fire, always watching it, always tending it. At night, coals are carefully banked in a specific way, covered with just the right amount of ash to preserve heat while limiting oxygen flow, creating conditions that allow embers to survive through the long cold nights until morning when they can be brought back to full flame. The person responsible for the fire becomes a position of importance in the group, someone whose role is recognized as crucial, who might be excused from other duties because maintaining the fire is itself a full-time job that keeps everyone alive. Children are taught from the earliest age to respect the fire, never to play near it or disturb it, because everyone understands that losing the fire could mean dying. Stories become more important than they had perhaps ever been before. In the evenings, as people gather around the carefully maintained fire, as the sun sets early because the days are shorter during the volcanic winter, as the temperature drops and the darkness presses in from outside the firelight, the elders speak. They tell stories about the time before the cold came, keeping alive the memory of what normal weather felt like, what abundant food looked like, how life used to be before the crisis. But more importantly, they tell stories that carry essential survival information encoded in narrative form, disguised as entertainment but serving the crucial function of preserving and transmitting knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. These stories are not the simple tales we might imagine when we think of prehistoric humans sitting around fires. They are sophisticated survival manuals compressed into narrative form, designed to be memorable and engaging enough that young people will pay attention and remember. A story about hunting might go something like this, told in whatever language the group spoke, a language lost to history but conveying information that would have sounded something like this if translated into modern English. The springbok feeds in the early morning, just after the sun rises, when dew is still on the grass and the air is cool. They gather in herds for safety, always alert, always watching for predators. Watch for the sentinel, the one who stands apart from the others, the one who doesn't graze but instead keeps watch while the others feed. This is the one who will spot you first, the one who will give the alarm if you approach carelessly. You must approach from downwind, moving when they move, freezing absolutely still when they freeze, becoming invisible through stillness and patience. Your spear must fly true because you will likely only get one chance. If you miss, if the herd scatters, you will not catch them. They can run faster and longer than any human. Your only advantage is surprise and accuracy. A child listening to this story isn't being told a tale for pure entertainment, isn't hearing a fable with a moral lesson. They're receiving precise, actionable knowledge about how to hunt springbok, information that might save their life or the lives of their group members years or decades in the future when that child has grown to adulthood and needs to provide food for their own family. The story format makes the information easier to remember than a simple list of instructions would be. The narrative structure creates hooks that memory can grasp onto. The vivid details, the description of morning dew and the watchful sentinel, help the information stick in ways that dry recitation of facts never could. Toolmaking during this bottleneck period shows fascinating evolution that suggests people were thinking harder about their tools, investing more care in their creation, planning further ahead than they might have needed to do in times of abundance. At Blombo's Cave, another South African archaeological site located in a similar coastal setting to Pinnacle Point, archaeologists found sophisticated tools dating to the period of the volcanic winter and its aftermath. These are compound tools, more complex than simple stone implements, showing evidence of planning and multi-step processes. Spear points are hafted to wooden shafts using carefully prepared adhesive, a substance made from plant resin that has been collected from specific trees, mixed with ground ochre in precise proportions to achieve the right stickiness and strength, heated to exactly the right temperature to make it workable but not so hot that it breaks down chemically, and then applied precisely to join the stone point to the wooden shaft in a bond that will hold under the stress of hunting large animals. Making such a compound tool requires not just skill but extended planning and a sophisticated understanding of materials and their properties. The entire process might take days from start to finish if we account for all the steps. First, you need to find the right stone, selecting from among many possible candidates to choose one that has the right fracture properties and will nap into a useful shape. Then you must nap that stone, striking it carefully with another stone or piece of antler, removing flakes in a specific sequence that gradually reveals the spear point hiding in the raw material. You need to gather specific plants to collect resin, knowing which species produce usable resin and when in their growing cycle that resin is most accessible. You need to locate ochre deposits, possibly traveling significant distances to find them, and then process the ochre by grinding it into powder. The adhesive must be mixed in the correct proportions. Too much ochre and it becomes brittle, too little and it won't harden properly. Heat must be applied carefully, probably using coals from the fire, achieving temperatures high enough to make the resin workable but not so high that it burns or loses its adhesive properties. The application of the adhesive to join point and shaft must be done precisely, with enough adhesive to create a strong bond but not so much that it adds unnecessary weight or makes the balance of the spear awkward. Then the whole assembly must be allowed to cure for perhaps days, resisting the temptation to use it immediately because a half-cured joint will fail at exactly the wrong moment, probably when you've just thrown the spear at an animal you desperately need to kill for food. Each step in this process requires knowledge that exists in the minds of the tool makers and must be transmitted to the next generation. And the entire process requires understanding that this effort now, this investment of time and energy and resources in creating a high-quality tool, will pay off later when you need a reliable weapon. This represents sophisticated cognition, the kind of planning for the future that sets humans apart from most other species, the ability to invest in tomorrow even when today is uncertain and survival itself is not guaranteed. The volcanic winter may have actually accelerated this kind of forward-thinking behavior and made it more prevalent in human populations. When resources are abundant and conditions are easy, you can afford to be somewhat inefficient in your tool use. A poorly made spear that breaks after one use? No problem. Just make another one tomorrow. Materials are plentiful and your time isn't constrained by immediate survival needs. A fire that goes out? Restart it easily enough, or borrow coals from a neighboring group. Food that spoils before you can eat it? Find more tomorrow. The land is rich and hunting is good. But when survival is marginal, when every day is a struggle and every mistake could cascade into catastrophe, efficiency suddenly matters enormously. A good spear might mean the difference between successfully hunting an animal and going hungry. A maintained fire is the literal difference between staying warm enough to survive and dying of exposure. Every decision carries weight, every action has consequences that can determine whether you live or die, whether your group survives or disappears from history entirely. So people became careful and thoughtful in ways that left evidence in the archaeological record. They invested in quality over quantity, maintaining their tools instead of making disposable ones, repairing things that could be repaired instead of simply discarding them and making new ones. They protected their knowledge, creating cultural mechanisms to ensure that crucial information survived even when individuals died. They developed redundancy in skills, making sure that multiple people knew how to perform essential tasks so that losing one person wouldn't mean losing a crucial capability. They innovated when necessary, developing new tools and new techniques to cope with the changed conditions of the volcanic winter. And they did something else too, something that would eventually lead to one of humanity's most important transitions. They began to move, not just within their traditional territories but beyond them. Because while the coast provided survival, while the shellfish and seabirds and occasional seal or whale carcass kept people alive through the worst of the crisis, it wasn't a permanent solution. It wasn't abundant enough to support population growth or comfortable enough to feel like home. It was a refuge, a lifeboat in a storm, but not a destination anyone would choose in better times. And as the volcanic winter began to ease, very slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, some groups started to look beyond the shoreline with hope rather than despair. They started to wonder what lay inland now that years had passed. They wondered whether the world might be recovering, whether the interior might be livable again, whether there was any future beyond simply surviving day to day on the margins of the ocean. The ocean is constant in ways that land never is. Tides rise and fall with the moon's gravitational pull, arriving with such regularity that people can learn to predict them with remarkable accuracy, knowing without clocks or calendars that high tide will come approximately every 12 hours, that spring tides when the sun and moon align will be higher than normal tides, that neap tides when the sun and moon pull at right angles will be lower. Waves arrive in their eternal rhythm, patterns of energy traveling across thousands of miles of open water to break on shores with a constancy that becomes almost hypnotic if you listen long enough. Even during a volcanic winter, even when the sky is gray and the air is cold and the world seems determined to end everything living on land, the ocean continues its ancient work, indifferent to human suffering, maintaining the cycles that had existed long before humans evolved and would continue long after humans disappeared if we failed to survive this crisis. For humans pressed against the coast by necessity rather than choice, forced there by the collapse of inland ecosystems, the ocean became more than just a food source providing shellfish and seaweed and occasional protein from stranded marine mammals. It became a highway, a route for migration that didn't require crossing hostile deserts or frozen highlands or territories claimed by other desperate groups who might view newcomers as competition rather than potential allies. Picture the southern coast of Africa as it existed 70,000 years ago. Rocky cliffs rising from beaches, carved by millennia of wave action into complex landscapes of caves and overhangs and protected spaces. Sandy beaches stretching between the rocky sections, places where walking was easy and children could play without constant fear of falling from heights. Estuaries where rivers met the sea in mixing zones of fresh and salt water, areas particularly rich in life because they received nutrients from both terrestrial and marine sources. Every kilometer of coastline offered similar resources with variations in abundance and accessibility. Shellfish clung to rocks in the intertidal zone, their populations renewing themselves with each tide as larvae settled and grew into adult organisms. Seabirds nested on cliffs during breeding seasons, their eggs a valuable source of concentrated nutrition for anyone brave enough to climb the dangerous rock faces to reach the nests. Occasionally, if fortune smiled, a seal might haul out on a beach to rest or give birth, providing a tempting target for hunters willing to risk the dangerous business of approaching an animal that could move surprisingly fast in short bursts and whose bite could cause serious injury. Sometimes, perhaps once every few years in a given stretch of coast, a whale might wash ashore, dead or dying, its massive body containing enough meat and blubber to feed an entire group for weeks if the group could process and preserve the windfall before it rotted. When resources in one area became depleted from intensive gathering, when the shellfish had been collected until the populations needed time to recover, when the seabird nesting sites had been raided enough that the birds began nesting elsewhere to avoid the human predation, groups could move along the coast to new areas. Following the shoreline east toward the rising sun, or west toward where the sun sets, to new beaches and new tide pools and new sources of the marine foods that kept people alive. This coastal migration wasn't planned in any organized way, with groups setting out on deliberate journeys towards specific destinations they had learned about from others. It was more organic than that, more gradual, driven by the simple logic of moving when staying became untenable. A group occupies a stretch of beach for months or even years, long enough to learn its rhythms and resources intimately. They gather shellfish, collect seabird eggs during the breeding season, maybe occasionally hunt the seals that visit certain beaches during certain times of year. The group's children grow up knowing every rock pool, every section of cliff, every stretch of sand. But eventually, whether from resource depletion or simply from the human tendency toward curiosity and exploration, someone wonders what lies beyond the next headland, what beaches exist beyond the visible horizon. Maybe food has become scarcer, the gathering taking longer each day to collect enough to feed everyone. Maybe there's been a conflict within the group, a disagreement serious enough that some members decide to leave rather than continue the tension. Maybe a particularly devastating storm has damaged the group's main shelter, making them homeless and requiring them to find a new place to live anyway. Or maybe it's just wanderlust, the simple human desire to see what's over the next hill, to explore unknown territory, to find new places that might be better than familiar ones. So they move, carrying their children and their elderly, bringing their tools and their knowledge, traveling along the coast to the next beach or the one after that. They stay there for months or years, depleting resources or growing restless, and then move again. Over generations, this process can carry people across vast distances without any individual ever traveling more than perhaps a few dozen kilometers from their birthplace. Your grandfather was born in one place. Your father moved one beach to the east. You move another beach further. Your children will move again. Century by century, this patient migration can cover hundreds or even thousands of kilometers, populations flowing along coastlines like water flowing through channels, following the path of least resistance. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that some human groups during and after the bottleneck period began moving northeast from southern Africa, following the coast of the Indian Ocean as it curves around the continent. Through what we now call Mozambique, with its long stretches of beach interrupted by the mouths of rivers flowing down from the interior, past the region that is now Tanzania, where the Great Rift Valley meets the ocean and geological forces have created a complex coastal landscape. Along the shores of what is now Kenya and Somalia, where the coastline becomes more arid but the ocean resources remain available. And eventually, for some groups, beyond Africa entirely, crossing the mouth of the Red Sea during periods when sea levels were low enough to make the crossing possible with simple rafts or even on foot if conditions were exactly right. The coast provided a route out of Africa that didn't require the kinds of adaptations that moving into desert or mountain environments would have demanded. As long as you stayed near the water, you had access to food that was relatively predictable even if it wasn't abundant. You didn't need to learn entirely new survival skills or develop completely new technologies. The techniques that worked for gathering shellfish in South Africa worked equally well for gathering shellfish in Mozambique or Tanzania or the Arabian Peninsula. The knowledge was portable, transferable to new locations with only minor adjustments for local conditions and species. But coastal living, while it provided survival during the crisis, required its own specialized knowledge that groups had to develop through experience and sometimes through costly trial and error. Timing the tides became crucial, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when high tide was approaching, when low tide would expose the maximum area of productive gathering ground. Understanding which shellfish species were safe to eat and during which seasons became a matter of life and death, because some species accumulate toxins during certain times of year when harmful algae bloom in the ocean, toxins that can cause paralysis or death if consumed. Learning to read the ocean's moods, to recognize the signs of approaching storms or dangerous wave conditions, became essential for any group living close to the water. Knowing when waves would be dangerous, when rip currents might form that could sweep unwary waders out to sea, when children playing near the water needed to be called back to safety before conditions became life-threatening. Archaeological sites from this period, coastal caves and beach campsites occupied during the bottleneck and the slow recovery that followed, show evidence of increasingly sophisticated shellfish processing techniques. At some locations, archaeologists have found the remains of small fires built directly on beaches, hearths constructed from rocks and used to create hot coals that could steam open stubborn shells that were difficult to crack manually. The heated rocks from these ancient fires remain visible thousands of years later, small cairns of fire-cracked stone that mark the spots where people solved the problem of accessing the nutrition locked inside tough shells by applying heat and steam. Other sites show evidence of shell middens organized in ways that suggest deliberate management, with certain areas used for discarding waste while other areas were kept clean for living space. An early form of spatial organization that indicates people were thinking about hygiene and comfort even during the desperate struggle for survival. As people moved along the coast during the bottleneck period and the years that followed, they maintained some contact with inland groups when such groups existed and when travel between coast and interior was feasible. The coast wasn't a completely sealed corridor cutting its inhabitants off from the rest of humanity. Rivers flowing to the ocean created natural pathways that connected coastal regions to the interior, valleys that offered routes inland for anyone willing to travel them. During the worst of the volcanic winter, these connections might have been largely unused, with inland areas too hostile to make travel worthwhile and coastal groups too focused on survival to spare members for exploration. But as conditions gradually began to improve, as the volcanic winter started its slow, painful retreat, the connections between coast and interior became more active again. And as the volcanic winter gradually eased year by year and decade by decade, as temperatures crept slowly upward and rainfall patterns began to normalize and the sun became visible more frequently through the thinning ash veil, the interior of Africa slowly became livable again. Rains returned, not abundant at first but sufficient to support life. Not the heavy reliable rains of better times, but enough to allow plants to grow again, to fill water holes in rivers, to create the conditions necessary for ecosystems to begin rebuilding. Plants began to recover, following a predictable sequence of colonization. First came the hardy species, the ones adapted to survive in marginal conditions, grasses and tough shrubs that could tolerate poor soils and irregular rainfall, pioneer species that prepared the ground for what would come later. Then gradually, as soil conditions improved and moisture became more reliable, trees began to return, their seeds carried by wind or by the few birds and animals that had survived the catastrophe. The animal populations that had collapsed to tiny remnant groups, herbivores that had barely clung to existence through the worst years, began to rebuild their numbers. A few surviving antelope, no longer facing starvation every day, began to breed successfully again. Their offspring survived more frequently as nutrition improved. Those offspring grew to maturity and bred in their turn. Year by year, the herds grew larger, still small compared to pre-crisis populations but growing, expanding, reclaiming territories that had been empty. Humans living on the coast noticed these changes. Scouting parties moving inland along river valleys, exploring territories that had been abandoned years or decades earlier, found game again. Not plentiful herds like the stories elders told about the time before the cold, but animals. Present. Alive. Trackable. A small group of antelope here, their tracks fresh in the morning dew. An elephant's path there, vegetation trampled and branches broken showing where the giant had passed recently. Signs that life was returning to the wounded land, that the interior might be becoming livable again for humans willing to take the risk of leaving the reliable coast for the uncertain interior. How long does a volcanic winter last when the eruption is as massive as Toba, when the amount of material thrown into the stratosphere is measured in hundreds of cubic miles, when the particles are fine enough to circulate in the upper atmosphere for years? The answer is complex and depends on which aspect of the crisis you're measuring. The initial most severe cooling, when temperatures dropped by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius across much of the planet, lasted perhaps 6 to 10 years according to climate models and evidence from ice cores drilled from ancient glaciers. During that time, during that first desperate decade, global temperatures were at their lowest, the reduction in sunlight was most severe, agricultural potential even for the simple gathering and seasonal harvesting that humans practiced was nearly zero, and survival was more difficult than it had ever been in human history. But climate doesn't recover instantly from a shock this large. The Earth's climate system has inertia built into it, feedback loops and interconnected processes that mean changes persist long after the initial forcing has diminished. Even after temperatures began to rise from their lowest point, they rose slowly, grudgingly, taking decades or even centuries to return to anything approaching pre-eruption normal. The ash particles in the atmosphere gradually settled out, pulled down by gravity, washed out by rainfall, but this process took years for the larger particles and even longer for the finest particles that could remain suspended in the stratosphere for a decade or more, circulating in high-altitude winds that carried them around the planet again and again before they finally fell. For humans living through this extended crisis, there was no clear moment of ending, no day when someone could reasonably say that the volcanic winter was over and normal times had returned. No celebration marking the recovery, no ritual acknowledging that the crisis had passed, because there was no obvious ending to acknowledge. Instead, there was just continuation, a slow gradual shift from terrible conditions to merely bad conditions to tolerable conditions, changes so gradual that they might not be noticeable from one year to the next but accumulated over decades into something that felt like improvement. Cold years stretching into decades, each one perhaps slightly less cold than the one before but the change too small to bring real hope. Generations born during the middle of the crisis who never knew the warm world their grandparents described in stories told around fires, who grew up in the cold and the gray and accepted those conditions as normal because they had never experienced anything else. Imagine being born during the volcanic winter, perhaps 20 or 30 years after the initial eruption, being born into a world that has never known your grandparents' descriptions of warmth and abundance. Your parents tell you stories about the time before, tales that seem almost mythological because they describe things so different from your lived experience. They talk about grass growing tall and golden across endless savannas, about how you could walk through it and it would brush against your shoulders, how the wind made waves in it like waves in the ocean. They describe animals as being plentiful, herds so large that they darkened the ground beneath them when they migrated, so numerous that hunting them was merely a matter of choosing which animal to target rather than the desperate search for any animal at all that characterizes hunting in your time. They tell about the sun shining bright and hot, so hot that people sought shade during the middle of the day, so bright that looking directly at it could hurt your eyes, not the dim pale disk that you see through the permanent haze of ash that still fills the upper atmosphere decades after the initial eruption. But you've never experienced any of that. These stories of warmth and abundance exist for you only as stories, tales from an almost mythological past that might or might not have been real. Your entire life has been characterized by gray skies that rarely clear completely, by cold winds that make you wrap yourself tighter in whatever animal skins you have available, by careful rationing of food because food is always scarce and you never know when the next meal might come. You've grown up learning to collect shellfish from tide pools because that's what provides the most reliable food, what your mother taught you to gather because her mother taught her during the crisis, a skill that has become central to survival even though your grandmother's grandmother might never have bothered with shellfish because better food was easily available. You've never tracked a springbok across open savanna because there are no springbok in the territories you know, no herds of grazing animals to provide the meat your ancestors depended on, only the stories about how hunting used to be easier in the time before. The old world, the warm, abundant world your grandparents describe, exists only in stories told around carefully maintained fires on cold evenings. Your reality is the harsh world of the volcanic winter, not as harsh as it was at the beginning when your grandparents were young and starvation was an immediate daily threat, but still harsh, still cold, still requiring constant vigilance and effort just to survive. And yet you adapt to this reality because adaptation is what humans do, because the human capacity to adjust to new normals is perhaps our species' greatest strength. You don't spend your time mourning a warm world you never knew. Instead, you build a life within the cold world you inhabit, finding joy and meaning and purpose despite the difficult circumstances. There's a psychological phenomenon that researchers call baseline adjustment or hedonic adaptation, the human tendency to adapt psychologically to new circumstances and return to a relatively stable level of happiness regardless of positive or negative changes in circumstances. Humans are remarkably good at this adjustment, at accepting new conditions as normal and reorganizing their expectations accordingly. Lottery winners often return to their baseline happiness levels within a few years despite their dramatically changed circumstances. People who experience traumatic injuries often eventually adapt to their new physical limitations and report happiness levels not dramatically different from before their injuries. The hedonic treadmill keeps running, and people adjust their baseline to whatever their current circumstances happen to be. The volcanic winter generation experienced this adjustment in profound ways. They didn't spend their lives consumed by grief over a world they had never known, didn't waste energy yearning for warmth they had never experienced. They adjusted their baseline to accommodate the cold and the scarcity, accepting these conditions as the normal background of existence rather than as a crisis that would eventually end. They built lives within these constraints, finding ways to experience joy and connection and meaning even during the ongoing disaster. They fell in love with each other, forming pair bonds and family groups based on attraction and compatibility and the simple human need for connection. They had children, bringing new life into a difficult world but doing so with hope that those children would survive and thrive, that the future might hold something better even if the present was hard. They laughed at jokes and stories, finding humor in the small absurdities of daily life because humor is a coping mechanism that allows people to deal with stress and hardship. They argued about the kinds of things people always argue about, questions of fairness and resource distribution and whose turn it is to maintain the fire and how food should be shared and all the minutiae of group living that creates friction even in the best circumstances. They told stories around fires, passing evenings in conversation and shared narrative because entertainment and social connection matter even during or perhaps especially during difficult times. They painted their bodies with ochre mixed with fat, decorating themselves for ceremonies and celebrations we can only imagine, maintaining the human tendency toward art and adornment even when survival itself was not guaranteed. They made tools with care and skill, taking pride in their work because humans need to feel competent and capable even when external circumstances are dire. They were fully human, living fully human lives, despite or perhaps because of the extreme circumstances they inhabited, proving that humanity isn't defined by comfort and abundance but by our capacity to create meaning and connection regardless of circumstances. But the long freeze did leave its marks on survivors, changes that show up when we examine the genetic and archaeological record from this period. Genetic studies of modern human populations suggest that during the extended bottleneck period, certain genes became more common than they had been before the crisis, genes that were apparently advantageous during times of scarcity and hardship. Genes related to fat storage and metabolism, variants that allowed people to build up fat reserves more efficiently during times when food was available and then use those reserves more slowly during times of scarcity, became more prevalent in populations that survived. It's possible and perhaps likely that people who were genetically better suited to surviving on limited calories, whose metabolisms were more efficient at extracting nutrition from the poor diets available during the volcanic winter, were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce and pass those genes to their children. Natural selection operating at emergency speed, not over millions of years but over just a few dozen generations, winnowing the human gene pool and favoring variants that provided even small advantages in the desperate struggle for survival. Necessity, as the saying goes, is the mother of invention, and rarely has necessity been more pressing or more desperate than during the human population bottleneck when survival itself was in question and innovation might mean the difference between a lineage continuing into the future or ending in an unmarked grave on some forgotten beach. During the volcanic winter and the slow recovery that followed, necessity was everywhere, pressing on every aspect of life, demanding solutions to problems that our ancestors had never faced before. And invention followed, sometimes in dramatic ways that left clear evidence in the archaeological record, sometimes in subtle shifts that can only be detected by careful analysis of tools and artifacts from this period compared to those from earlier times. At Blombos Cave, in the same layer of archaeological deposits that dates to approximately 70,000 years ago, the period immediately during and after the Toba eruption and the beginning of the volcanic winter, archaeologists found something remarkable that speaks to the sophistication of human thought and planning even during the worst times. They found a workshop, a designated space where people prepared ochre paint with a level of care and planning that goes beyond simple body decoration. The workshop contained abalone shells being used as containers, their hollow interiors perfect for holding liquids or powders, each shell carefully selected for size and shape and condition. Bone tools were present that had been used for mixing, their ends worn smooth from repeated use stirring pigments and binders together. Ground ochre powder filled some containers, the ochre having been collected as raw chunks from deposits somewhere in the region and then laboriously ground into fine powder using stones as mortars and pestles. Charcoal pieces were present, probably added to the ochre to darken the color or adjust its properties. Animal fat had been mixed in to create a medium that would adhere to skin or possibly to other surfaces. Even quartz crystals were found in the workshop, their purpose unclear but their presence suggesting they were valued for some reason, perhaps aesthetic or symbolic. Someone had taken the time and effort to gather these materials from multiple locations, to process them carefully, to mix them in specific proportions that produced a paint with desired properties of color and consistency and adhesion. This wasn't casual face painting done on a whim for momentary decoration. This was deliberate preparation of a valuable material, done with planning and care that indicates the end product was important. We don't know exactly what the ochre paint was used for, though body decoration seems likely given the human tendency toward personal adornment that appears in archaeological sites across the world. But the level of preparation, the sophistication of the workshop, the investment of time and resources into creating this paint suggests that whatever it was used for, it mattered deeply to the people making it. Perhaps the volcanic winter, with all its stress and fear and uncertainty, drove people to strengthen their cultural and spiritual practices as a way of maintaining identity and social cohesion during the crisis. Marking the body with carefully prepared paint might have been a way of affirming individual identity and group membership, of maintaining human dignity and cultural continuity in the face of natural catastrophe that seemed designed to strip away everything that made life worth living. The paint might have been used for ceremonies that helped people process their fear and grief, rituals that acknowledged the dead or asked for help from whatever spiritual forces people believed in or simply brought the community together in shared experience. Or perhaps the use of ochre paint was practical as well as symbolic, because ochre has antibacterial properties that modern science has confirmed, and mixed with fat it creates a substance that can protect skin from sun and wind and insects, providing real physical benefits in addition to whatever symbolic or social functions it served. In a time when every advantage mattered, when even small improvements in health or comfort could mean the difference between surviving and not surviving, body paint might have been both symbol and tool, both cultural practice and survival technology. The tools themselves changed during the bottleneck period in ways that archaeological analysis can detect and measure. Before the volcanic winter, stone tools were already sophisticated, showing the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of thousands of years of human tool-making tradition. But during and after the bottleneck, there's a marked increase in blade technology, a shift toward creating long, thin flakes of stone that could be used for cutting and that represented a more efficient use of raw material than the earlier chunkier tools. A single stone core, if properly worked by someone with skill and understanding of how stone fractures, could yield dozens of blade flakes, each one sharp enough to cut meat or process hides, each one easily carried and easily replaced if it broke during use. This efficiency mattered enormously when good stone sources might be far away from where people were living, when traveling to collect raw materials meant expending energy and time that people could barely afford to spare, when every resource needed to be used as completely and efficiently as possible. Spear technology improved in detectable ways. Points became more streamlined and carefully shaped, showing greater attention to balance and weight distribution. Hafting techniques, the methods used to attach stone points to wooden shafts, became more refined and sophisticated. Some archaeologists studying tools from this period have argued that humans during the bottleneck might have invented the atlotl or spear thrower, a device that dramatically increases the distance and force with which a spear can be thrown. With an atlotl, which acts as an extension of the arm's leverage and allows a spear to be thrown with much greater velocity, a hunter who previously needed to get within 20 meters of dangerous prey could now throw effectively from 40 or 50 meters away. That extra distance is the difference between hunting that brings the hunter into close contact with animals that can gore or trample or otherwise kill a human, and hunting that allows the hunter to stay at a safer distance, reducing injury risk while maintaining killing effectiveness. Innovation driven by the simple desire to eat without dying in the process, technology developed because the alternative was unacceptable. Recovery doesn't announce itself. There's no day when the sun breaks through the ash and someone declares, "The volcanic winter is over." Instead, there are small signs easily missed that accumulate over months and years. Perhaps it begins with rain. A storm that seems slightly warmer than the ones before. Water that doesn't have the bitter taste of ash. Or perhaps it's a plant. A tree that was stunted and struggling suddenly putting out new growth. Leaves unfolding in the spring with more vigor than the previous year. Or an animal. The return of a bird species that hadn't been seen in years. The discovery of fresh tracks from an antelope herd passing through. Small signs. Gentle ones. The earth remembering how to be fertile. Climate recovery from a supervolcano is complex. The ash settles out of the atmosphere first. Without particles blocking sunlight, temperatures begin to rise. But they rise irregularly, one region might warm while another stays cold. Ocean currents, which move heat around the planet, take years to re-establish their normal patterns. For humans, this meant uncertainty. A group that moved inland, hoping the recovery would continue, might find themselves in a region where temperatures dropped again during an unusually cold season. They'd have to retreat to the coast or find another solution. But overall, decade by decade, the trend was positive. Warmth returning. Life returning. Grass grew taller. Year by year, the savanna recovered its golden color. Seeds that had lain dormant in the ground, waiting, began to sprout. Plants that had been reduced to a few isolated pockets began to spread again. The herbivores responded. Antelope populations grew. Where there had been perhaps a few dozen animals scattered across a huge territory, now there were hundreds. Zebra returned to their traditional migration routes. Elephants, which had been pushed to the edge of extinction, began to recover. And where herbivores thrived, predators followed. Lions. Leopards. Hyenas. The dangerous megafauna that made the African landscape both abundant and deadly. For humans, this recovery was a mixed blessing. More game meant better hunting. But more predators meant greater danger. The safe coastal existence, where the biggest threat was a rough wave or a sharp rock, gave way again to a landscape where you could be hunted as easily as you hunted. Groups had to relearn old skills or learn new ones. How to protect children from lions. How to move safely through tall grass where leopards might hide. How to track game across long distances, pursuing herds that could now migrate with the seasons. Not everyone made the transition successfully. Some coastal groups stayed on the coast, maintaining the lifestyle they developed during the crisis. Their descendants would eventually migrate along the coastline to other continents, never straying far from the ocean. But others moved inland, returning to the savanna, the forests, the varied landscapes of Africa's interior. Archaeological sites from this period show renewed occupation in areas that had been abandoned during the volcanic winter. Caves that had been empty for generations show fresh signs of human presence. Fire pits. Stone tools. The remains of meals. Humanity was spreading again. Not rapidly but steadily. The population grew. Groups split when they became too large. Some moved into new territories. Others stayed in traditional lands, now able to support larger populations. The genetic bottleneck was ending. Not in the sense that genetic diversity immediately increased, that would take thousands of generations of mutation and variation, but in the sense that the crisis had passed. Humans were no longer teetering on the edge of extinction. The population was stable, growing, resilient. And within that growing population, some groups began to look beyond Africa. To the north, where the Red Sea narrowed to a strait that might, during low sea levels, be crossable. To lands beyond that were rumored, or imagined, to hold new opportunities. The stage was set for the next chapter of human history. The migration out of Africa. The colonization of the world. But that migration was only possible because of what the bottleneck had taught us. How to survive in marginal environments. How to cooperate under stress. How to innovate when the old ways failed. The volcanic winter had nearly ended us. But it had also prepared us for everything that came after. Every human alive today carries the legacy of the bottleneck in their DNA. When a population shrinks to a few thousand individuals, genetic diversity decreases. Rare variants disappear. The gene pool becomes shallower, more uniform. This shows up in human genetics in fascinating ways. Compared to other large mammal species, humans are remarkably genetically similar to each other. Two humans from opposite sides of the planet are more genetically alike than two chimpanzees from neighboring groups in the same forest. This similarity is the signature of the bottleneck. We all descend from those few thousand survivors, and we haven't had enough time or population size since then to develop the genetic diversity typical of a species our age. But low genetic diversity isn't necessarily a disadvantage. The survivors of the bottleneck weren't a random sample of humanity. They were the ones who happened to have the right traits, in the right circumstances, to endure the volcanic winter. Maybe they were slightly better at digesting shellfish, or had metabolisms that could function on fewer calories, or possessed immune systems that resisted the diseases that swept through stressed populations. Or maybe, more likely, they had the right cultural traits. They were part of groups that cooperated well, that shared knowledge effectively, that made good collective decisions about when to move and when to stay, when to take risks and when to play it safe. Natural selection during the bottleneck wasn't just biological. It was cultural. Groups with better cultures, better at cooperation, knowledge transmission, adaptation, survived preferentially. And the children born after the bottleneck inherited both the genes and the culture of those successful groups. Imagine being born in the generation after the worst of the volcanic winter. Your parents survived the starvation years. They know what it's like to be truly desperate, and they're determined that you'll have better. They teach you carefully how to make tools, how to find food, how to read weather, track animals, identify plants. The knowledge they've preserved at such cost, they give to you freely. You grow up in a world that's slowly improving. Each year, food is a little more abundant than the last. The group is a little larger, a little more secure. The stories of the terrible cold years are your parents' stories, not yours. But you carry the legacy of those years anyway. In your genes. In your culture. In the lessons you learn about not taking anything for granted, about valuing cooperation, about being prepared for disaster because disaster can come. As the post-bottleneck generations grew and thrived, they built on what their ancestors had learned. Tool technology continued to advance. Symbolic behavior, art, decoration, possibly early religion, became more elaborate. Social groups became larger and more complex, requiring new ways of organizing, new social rules, new methods of conflict resolution. Language, which certainly existed before the bottleneck, likely became more sophisticated afterward. When your survival depends on transmitting complex knowledge quickly and accurately, language ability matters. Groups with more effective communication would have advantages. Some researchers argue that the bottleneck might have been when human language shifted from something simple to something approaching modern complexity. That the pressure of the crisis drove rapid evolution in communication skills. Whether that's true or not, the post-bottleneck population was different from what came before. More cohesive, more innovative, more capable of adapting to new environments. And about 60 to 70,000 years ago, some of those populations began to move north. While Africa was recovering, the volcanic winter was ending. The familiar landscapes of home were becoming livable again. So why would groups of humans choose to leave the continent where our species evolved? The answer is probably simple, because they could. Human populations were growing. Territories that had comfortably supported 10 people during the bottleneck now held 30. Good hunting grounds, good water sources, good campsites, these became contested. Groups competing for the same resources faced choices. Fight, or move. Some fought. Some shared. And some moved. Moving meant following game herds, following coastlines, following rivers. And some of those paths led north. The Sinai Peninsula, the land bridge between Africa and Asia, had always been there. But crossing it meant leaving the known world for the unknown. During low sea level periods, and sea levels fluctuated dramatically during ice ages, other routes opened too. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea might have been crossable on foot or with simple rafts during low water. Groups that took these routes entered a new world. The Middle East, 70,000 years ago, was different from Africa. The climate was less predictable. Winters could be cold in ways African winters never were. The plants and animals were unfamiliar. But the groups that migrated had been trained by the volcanic winter. They knew how to adapt. They'd survived the worst climate catastrophe in human history. A Middle Eastern winter was challenging, but not impossible. They adapted their tools for new materials, learned which local plants were edible, figured out the behavior patterns of unfamiliar game animals, established new territories, new campsites, new routes through the landscape. Genetic evidence shows that the initial migration out of Africa was small. Maybe a few hundred individuals in the first wave. But from that seed population, expansion continued. Some groups moved east, following the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, then around to South Asia and eventually to Southeast Asia and Australia. The coastal migration route, proven during the volcanic winter, worked in these new territories too. Other groups moved north and west, into the Levant and eventually Europe. Others went northeast, into Central Asia and eventually to East Asia, Siberia, and across the Bering Land Bridge to the Americas. Within about 40,000 years of leaving Africa, humans had reached every habitable continent except Antarctica. This expansion was one of the most remarkable events in the history of any species. And it was only possible because the bottleneck had prepared us for it. The volcanic winter had taught us how to survive in marginal environments, how to innovate rapidly when circumstances demand it, how to maintain social cohesion under stress, how to transmit knowledge across generations, how to adapt our diet, tools, and culture to new conditions. These lessons, learned in the crucible of near extinction, became the foundation for global colonization. Each new environment humans entered presented challenges. The Arctic required completely new technologies, insulated clothing, ice fishing techniques, seal hunting strategies. The tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia demanded different knowledge. Which trees had edible fruit, which rivers had crocodiles, how to move through dense jungle. But humans solved these problems. Over and over, in region after region, we adapted. We survived. We thrived. Because we were the children of survivors. Because the bottleneck had selected for adaptability, cooperation, innovation. Because our ancestors had faced the worst the planet could throw at them and had endured. We carried that resilience in our genes and in our cultures. And we used it to become a global species. Look around the world today. 8 billion humans. Every continent colonized. Every ecosystem inhabited. Languages by the thousands. Cultures in endless variety. Technology that would seem like magic to our ancestors. All of it springs from a bottleneck population of a few thousand people who survived a volcanic winter 70,000 years ago. That's a humbling thought. But it's also an inspiring one. Because what it means is that humans are survivors. Not just capable of surviving, but specialists in it. We've evolved, biologically and culturally, to endure catastrophes. The Toba eruption would have ended most species. A planet-wide climate catastrophe that destroys ecosystems, kills food sources, and lasts for decades? That's an extinction-level event. But we made it through. Not unchanged. The bottleneck left its marks on us. Our low genetic diversity. Our capacity for cooperation. Our cultural complexity. But we made it through. And the question worth asking is, what did the bottleneck teach us? What qualities did it select for, either genetically or culturally, that made the difference between extinction and survival? First, adaptability. Groups that could change their diet, their tools, their lifestyle when circumstances demanded survived. Groups that insisted on doing things the old way, that couldn't or wouldn't adapt, died out. This adaptability is still part of human psychology. We're remarkably flexible as a species. Give us a new environment, and we figure out how to live there. Present us with a new challenge, and we innovate solutions. Second, cooperation. Individual survival was impossible during the bottleneck. Groups that worked together, that shared resources, that supported their weak and their young, those groups made it. Groups that fragmented into competing individuals didn't. Modern humans are hyper-cooperative compared to most mammals. We work together in groups of millions, cities, nations, global organizations. This isn't normal in nature. Most animals cooperate in much smaller groups, usually kin-based. But we learned, during the bottleneck, that cooperation scales. That we're stronger together than apart. Third, knowledge transmission. Groups that preserved and shared knowledge survived. Groups that lost crucial information, how to make fire, how to find food, how to read weather, died. So we became very, very good at teaching and learning. Human children have the longest childhood of any mammal, a period of dependency during which they learn everything they need to know. This investment in education is costly. Children can't contribute much economically for years, but it pays off because knowledge is everything. Fourth, innovation. When the old ways stopped working, survivors innovated. New tools. New food sources. New social arrangements. Whatever it took to survive. Human innovation isn't just about being clever. It's about being willing to try new things, to experiment, to take calculated risks. And that willingness is part of our bottleneck legacy. But perhaps the most profound legacy is psychological. Humans who survived the volcanic winter knew that stability is an illusion. That the world can change, suddenly and catastrophically. That nothing is guaranteed. This knowledge could lead to despair. But for our ancestors, it led to resilience. To the understanding that when things fall apart, you endure. You adapt. You find a way forward. That resilience is in us still. In the refugee who rebuilds their life in a new country. In the community that recovers from a natural disaster. In the family that endures hardship and emerges stronger. We are survivors' children. And we carry their strength in our DNA, in our cultures, in our psychology. The volcanic winter nearly ended us. But it also forged us. Made us who we are. Gave us the tools, mental, social, cultural, to become a global species capable of extraordinary things. As you rest here now, warm and safe, consider this. Your body contains approximately 37 trillion cells. Each one carries DNA passed down through an unbroken chain of ancestry stretching back 70,000 years. Through the bottleneck, through the volcanic winter, through the moments when humanity came within a few hundred people of disappearing forever. Every one of your ancestors survived. Not just lived, survived. Through ice ages and droughts, through famines and diseases, through migrations across continents and encounters with predators and the thousand small disasters that could have ended their line. They survived so you could be here. And what did they survive with? Not claws or armor or venom. Not size or speed or strength. They survived with cooperation, with innovation, with the ability to teach their children, with the willingness to adapt when adaptation was required, with the capacity to endure when endurance seemed impossible. These are your inheritance. These gifts from the bottleneck population, tested in the crucible of the volcanic winter, passed down through countless generations, arriving finally in you. You carry the genes of the humans who survived the worst climate catastrophe our species ever faced. You carry their resilience, their adaptability, their stubborn refusal to give up even when the world itself seems to be ending. That's worth remembering, especially now as you drift toward sleep, as your conscious mind releases its grip and your body settles into rest. You are the product of an unbroken line of survivors. That strength is in you. Not just metaphorically. Literally in your cells, in your genes, in the deep structures of your brain and body. The volcanic winter ended. The ash settled. The sun returned. Life recovered. Not because anyone came to rescue our ancestors. Not because the world took pity on them. But because they endured. Because they cooperated. Because they adapted. Because they protected their children and their knowledge and their fire. Because they were human. Fully, completely human. And being human meant finding a way forward even when there seemed to be no way. That same humanity lives in you. So as you sleep, rest in the knowledge that you come from a long line of people who faced impossible odds and survived. Who endured volcanic winters and ice ages, migrations and disasters, the 1,000 challenges that could have ended human history but didn't. You are their legacy. Their gift to the future. And tomorrow, when you wake, you'll carry their strength into a new day. The fire is still burning. The one our ancestors protected through the darkest years of the volcanic winter. It's passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, down through the millennia. Now it burns in you. In your curiosity. In your resilience. In your capacity to learn and adapt and endure. Keep it safe. Feed it with kindness, with cooperation, with the willingness to help others survive their own winters. Because that's what survivors do. They survive. And then they help others survive too. Rest now. Sleep deeply. And dream, perhaps, of the distant ancestors who endured the cold so that you, warm and safe, could exist in this moment. Their story is your story. Their strength is your strength. And the long journey that began in Africa, 70,000 years ago, in the midst of a volcanic winter, continues in you.